As I was driving home one day, blasting classical music in my car, suddenly a super important question popped in my head. Were the Phoenicians responsible for the wealth of the Kingdom of Israel? When one thinks about Israel and Judah during the Iron Age, usually the well known kingdom of David and Solomon comes to mind, the very kingdom responsible for the first temple of Jerusalem. But it seems that the monarchy of David and Solomon was never really a united monarchy that included both Israel and Judah. We can actually look to the northern kingdom of Israel for a real life, rich, powerful kingdom within the lands of the Bible. And interestingly enough, during the Amride dynasty, the sphere of influence of this northern kingdom extended to Judah. As Israel Finkelstein and other Israeli archaeologists have discovered, in the early Iron Age, circa 1000 to 700 BCE, northern Israel, or the Kingdom of Israel, was far wealthier and more developed than the Kingdom of Judah. The capital, Samaria, was about the same size as Jerusalem would eventually be during the 7th to 6th centuries BCE. But how did Samaria, and more broadly the Kingdom of Israel, become so wealthy? I believe there is a strong argument to be made that the Phoenicians were mostly responsible for northern Israel's wealth, and I will be looking at Phoenician Israelite cultural and economic connections to make the case. The Phoenicians and Israelites were two Levantine Iron Age cultures, but I should provide some important Late Bronze Age background. The region that would eventually be inhabited by the Phoenicians and Israelites was home to various Canaanite city-states that were a part of the Egyptian Empire, and each was ruled by a vassal king. We see the relations between the Canaanite city-states and the Egyptian pharaoh in the El Amarna letters. At the end of the Bronze Age, there was a sudden collapse of these Canaanite city-states, caused by a combination of attacks by the Sea Peoples, drought, famine, and international connections being disrupted. Out of the ashes of the collapse of the Canaanite city-states arose the Israelites and Phoenicians. Now, some of you might be wondering, who were the Phoenicians? The Phoenicians were a Semitic Eastern Mediterranean civilization known for their widespread trade networks throughout the Mediterranean and possibly beyond. Their original city-states, such as Tyre, Byblos, and Sidon, were centered in modern Lebanon, and as they formed trade networks throughout the Mediterranean, they found colonies in North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. The Phoenician vessels were renowned for their ability to navigate the seas, even allowing navigators such as Hanno of Carthage to sail around the coast of West Africa. Herodotus claims that the Phoenicians even circumnavigated the entire continent of Africa. As successful merchants, the Phoenicians most notably traded in purple dyes and cedar wood. They established trade connections most notably with Egypt, which resulted in an exchange of goods and ideas, one example being the Egyptian influence on Phoenician art. We see this with the Phoenician sarcophagi, a notable example being that of Eshmunazar. There is also evidence for Phoenician trade and influence on other Mediterranean civilizations, such as the Etruscans. During the latter's Orientalizing period, one example of this Phoenician influence would be ashlar construction. The Phoenicians share cultural common ancestry with the Israelites that traces back to the Bronze Age Canaanites. As a result, the Phoenicians worshipped Canaanite gods such as Baal and Astarte. I tend to think the Phoenicians played a major role in northern Israel's economic development due to both their proximity to each other and the various connections the Phoenician, Syrian, and northern Israelite city-states had during the Late Bronze Age. All the Canaanite city-states of the Late Bronze Age were interconnected and traded with each other and other Bronze Age cultures, and since the Phoenicians and Israelites were descended from the Canaanites, they likely would have continued this relationship with each other. For example, Bronze Age Israel-Palestine saw Syrian influence in the realm of architecture, gates or fortifications, pottery, and there was importation of cylinder seals. Specific Middle Bronze Age sites with clear Syrian temples include Megiddo, Shechem, Nahariya, and Hatzor. Now you might be wondering, why would I bring up Bronze Age Syrian influence on the region of Palestine as support for the Phoenician Israelite connections going back to the Bronze Age? Well, for one, what is today Lebanon and the coast of Syria were part of the region of Canaan, and the city-states within those two areas were culturally Canaanite. This points in the direction of more northern Canaanite or Syrian influence flowing southward towards the city-states of Israel-Palestine since the Middle Bronze Age. With this Bronze Age Syrian Israel-Palestine exchange of culture and goods, most likely there were trade connections as well. The city-states in what would become Israel would continue this cultural and trade relationship with its northern neighbors into the Iron Age, as demonstrated by the northern Syrian influence on King Solomon's temple. Based on the textual evidence from the Book of Kings compared with the archaeological record from Bronze and Iron Age Syria, it seems that Solomon's temple had architectural predecessors in, or was influenced by northern Syrian Bit Hilani such as Tayyinat and Samal. There were even merchants from Damascus who have their own quarters or enclaves set up in various cities throughout Israel. It is not a stretch at all to propose that Phoenician cultural and economic connections would follow the Syrian influence, especially when it is clear that the Phoenician cultural and economic influence was much stronger than the Damascene Syrian influence. This is demonstrated by the fact that Aramean graffiti and seals are far fewer than those of the Phoenicians. Secondly, focusing on the cylinder seals found in Bronze Age Israel or Palestine, this line of archaeological evidence, along with copies of Hammurabi's law code found at Megiddo, demonstrate that the southern Canaanites, who would eventually become the Israelites, were more broadly open to economic and cultural relations with the other Near Eastern civilizations. As mentioned before, it seems obvious that the Phoenicians would establish trade connections with the Kingdom of Israel due to the geographic proximity of the two civilizations. When the Phoenicians first started expanding their trading empire, they built settlements in places such as Cyprus, so why wouldn't they make contact with their southern neighbors? In fact, there were portions of the region of Galilee that belonged to the cultural sphere of the Phoenicians. This is attested in the Hebrew Bible, specifically the Book of Kings, chapter 9, where it says King Solomon rewarded King Hiram with 20 cities in the region of Galilee. While it is debatable how historically reliable the Book of Kings is, and more specifically the narratives surrounding Solomon and Hiram, this instance of Solomon giving Hiram 20 cities in the Galilee probably reflects Phoenician settlement. One example of a Phoenician site in northern Israel is Tel Dor. As previously mentioned, written primary source evidence that the Phoenicians were in contact or trading with the northern Israel can be found in the Old Testament, specifically the Book of Kings. One notable reference in the Book of Kings would be King Ahab marrying a Phoenician princess, Jezebel, and setting up temples to Baal, a Phoenician or Canaanite deity. Ahab also built a palace in Samaria with a defensive wall that had Phoenician-style masonry. This is corroborated by the archaeological evidence that shows the origin of Israelite Ashlar was related to the Phoenicians. In fact, some scholars posit that Phoenician masons were employed to build the 10th and 9th century BCE Israelite structures. This leads to the more famous example of Israelite-Phoenician contact when King Solomon reached out to Hiram, king of Tyre, the Phoenician city, to send masons and workers to help build the temple. Cedar wood, which was one of the commodities the Phoenicians traded, was supposedly used in the building of the temple. Although Solomon's kingship was centered in Jerusalem in the kingdom of Judah, this particular story from the Book of Kings could reflect the Phoenicians trading extensively with the kingdom of Israel or Samaria, in addition to Judah. There were in fact Phoenician merchants, specifically from Tyre, who took up residence in Jerusalem. They would have handled exports of both Israel and Judah. There is also archaeological evidence from Samaria for trade and cultural exchange between the northern kingdom of Israel and the Phoenicians. Ostraca with Phoenician inscriptions have been found from northern Israel to sites in southern Judah, such as Kuntilet Arjud. This clearly indicates the Phoenicians were active all over Israel. It is important to note that Samaria was the cultural center and economic powerhouse of Iron Age Israel-Palestine. The archaeological evidence for their connections to the Phoenicians include inscriptions that have names with Baal epithets on them, other inscriptions with the Phoenician language found in Israel, and there are Egyptian-style ivory carvings found in Samaria or northern Israel, such as a sphinx and woman in the window. As explained before, the Phoenicians traded extensively with the Egyptians in the Iron Age, and the Phoenicians copied Egyptian art and motifs for their own art. The Egyptians essentially outsourced or used the Phoenicians as middlemen for trade in the eastern Mediterranean, and the fact that Egyptian-style ivory carvings are found in northern Israel indicates Israelite-Phoenician trade was going on. When they were excavated, These Egypto-Phoenician ivory carvings were accompanied with luxury prestige items such as cosmetic spoons, bottle stoppers, round pigside mirror handles, and harness ornaments. The fact that these luxury goods were found with the Phoenician ivory carvings indicates that there was an economic exchange going on between these two cultures as well as cultural exchange. It also indicates that there was an increasing aristocratic elite class that had high demand for these goods. The Phoenicians would have seen this opportunity to trade these goods with the Kingdom of Israel and tap into this market. Now, what do I mean when I say the Phoenicians helped develop the Samarian economy and contributed to the wealth of Samaria or the Kingdom of Israel? The Phoenicians clearly got extremely wealthy from their extensive trade across the Mediterranean, exporting goods from modern-day Lebanon such as purple dye and cedar wood that were valued across the Mediterranean. They also set up colonies in places such as Spain, North Africa, Sicily, and Sardinia, and were able to export or trade valuable commodities from these regions, which also contributed to their wealth. Archaeological and textual evidence points to Samaria and later Jerusalem becoming notably important centers of international trade, and a big cause of this was their benefiting from the Phoenician trade network. The Phoenicians imported a wide range of goods into Israel, such as metals, timber, textiles, especially their famous purple dyed garments, luxury vessels in metal, glass, faience, tridacna shells, aromatic ointments, and pottery. Both Israel and Judah were able to accumulate more wealth by importing these goods from their northern neighbors. The evidence indicates that both Samaria and later Jerusalem became important centers of international trade, which is due in large part to both kingdoms making serious inroads into the Phoenician trading network. The kingdom of Israel was wealthier than the kingdom of Judah up until the destruction by the Assyrians, and based on the evidence I just provided, and the fact that the kingdom of Israel or Samaria is closer to the Phoenician city-states than the kingdom of Judah, I would argue that the kingdom of Israel developed extensive trade or economic relationships with the Phoenicians, which gave the kingdom of Israel its wealth.